We wrapped up Pete Mondrian yesterday. I'm going to put up a 10-minute art fix that talks about how he got to that level of abstraction and what happened after that as well in his late years up to this weekend. This brings us, as I mentioned on Tuesday, to Dada, which is, we've been talking about a great number of art movements, primarily online, but I think we sort of touched on it in class a couple times as well. Art movements that were influenced in their thinking by the horrors of World War I. That for many people, World War I was the death of a dream, where prior to 1914, people saw industry as the great salvation of the future, that the machine, industrial revolution, and particularly beyond the industrial revolution, simply the idea of modern progress in machinery was going to open up a utopian modern era that was going to be terrific, and we've seen artists sort of adopt machine motifs in their pictures as a way of sort of, hey, the future's great. And for many of these artists, with maybe the exception of the futurists because they're creeps, right? But for many of these artists, World War I was the death of that dream, where the machinery that had seemed like it might be the salvation of culture turned out instead to be the bringer of death, doom, and destruction and pain. Right? Tanks, warships, airplanes all made their first appearances, right? Gas masks, mustard gas, trench warfare. It was horrible at the time, and fought right on their own home front, and at a scale that no one had ever really witnessed before. The horrors are just. And if you take back some of those 10-minute screencasts that I put up, those 10-minute art fixes on, particularly on German expressionism, the degree to which this wounded the psyche of Europeans is astounding, and in many ways affects the course of art from that point forward. So today we're looking at Dada, a movement that began as a protest to World War I during the war. Now, most of the other ones began as a protest after the war was over. Artists who had gone off to fight in the war can come back emotionally battered and decide to make an art in protest at the end of the war. So the Neue Sachlichkeit movement that I talked about online only begins around 1919, 1920. Right? Dada begins in 1915 in one of the neutral countries in Europe, Switzerland. And that's kind of important. The very first two places where we see the Dada movement take hold are places that are, at that point in history, neutral. Now, interestingly, Mondrian is also developing his art in a neutral country as well, at East Holland. But the first Dada group, 1915, is in Zurich. And at the heart of the Dada movement, the central driving idea behind Dada is that they wanted to reject rationality. They wanted to make an irrational art. They wanted to reject human intellect and reason. They felt that logic, knowledge, these were the factors that were behind the horrors that they saw in World War I. The effect of human intellect led us to more efficiently kill each other. So if that's the case, heck with it, right? Put it all behind us. Hans Arp, also known as Jean Arp, J-E-A-N, because he's in Switzerland, right, and they're trilingual, right? Hans is German for Jean, Genie, in French, right? So Hans Arp said that Dada wanted to replace the logical nonsense of men of today. They want to replace that with illogical senselessness. Right? So in other words, logic for them, they think, is really being kind of nonsensical, because if you're logical, you wouldn't make a machine that can kill. And that's what they tell them, right? Speaking of which, as warplanes fly overhead, right? They want to replace that with illogical senselessness. They want to upend Western society. They really are anarchists. And they feel in order to do this, they have to focus on irrational, emotional elements, intuition, childlike approaches to art. And all of these things would subvert that logical nonsense that art is talking about. So even the term Dada relates to this central agenda of not being sophisticated, not being logical, not being rational. Because in German, at least, Dada are some of the child's first words. It's just a hard consonant and a vowel, right? Dada is very, it just comes out, right? I imagine no matter how broke you get, you can probably still say Dada, right? It's just because your tongue hits your teeth, and that's the sound you make. And also, obviously, Dada, Papa, these are also what the child says to their parent, right? So it's focusing on that idea of a lack of sophisticated, mature rationality by focusing on children's nonsense sayings or even children's sayings towards their parents. Interestingly, the word Dada in German also is a slang word for a hobby horse. Do you know what a hobby horse is? A stick with a horse's head on it that will beat its right around as if it's a horse, right? So it's also totally nonsense, right? It's just, it's like Monty Python and the Holy Grail. You're pretending you have a horse when you don't. So these two things come together to emphasize what Dada is really all about. There's a story that the way they got the word Dada, I don't think this is true. They made this up, right? But this is the story that circulated about how they found the term Dada. Was that they took a big German dictionary, one of those really huge ones, that's like this thick, the kind that families used to keep, on the bookshelf. My parents had one of those growing up, Anyway, they put it on them like this, held it together, and just let it drop. Open. I said, laying on its back on a table. Flip it open up and go like that. And they hit the word Dada, and that's why they chose it. And again, that's utterly irrational. It's all about chance. It's all about a lack of logic, right? In that choice, a lack of deliberation. And what we'll see as we look at Dada art is, in fact, that idea of chance replacing planning, right? Is a way in which they feel they can make an art that is irrational, that is illogical. Because chance you can't control, right? They're trying to get away from the idea of control. Okay? So that's the central tenet behind Dada. This work of art, made by Art in Zurich, he made, and again by his story, he said he had a drawing he was working on and he didn't like it. It made him so angry that he just tore it up into little squares. And then he dropped the pieces to the floor. And then he looked down and all of a sudden he liked it. He liked the way the pieces fell on the floor, so he picked them up carefully and recreated that pattern by collaging them, shinkoing them down to a different sheet of paper. Right? So this is why it's a collage or arrangement according to the laws of chance, because he just threw had nothing, throws on the ground. That's it. Right? There's the solution I've never been able to find because his planning didn't do it for him. What ended up doing for him? Okay? Now, I'm not so sure I buy it. I can't imagine if you're going to tear up an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, or however big it was, I don't care, and drop it on the ground that you're going to get up and no overlap. It doesn't quite make sense. Right? He didn't just drop them onto this particular paper, but he picked them up and arranged them there. But perhaps the inspiration was there from the way that they had fallen. Right? So again, it's an accidental composition. And that idea of accident as a way to get to irrationality is one of the central hallmarks of Dada. Right? Okay. We have an art in the National Gallery from around the same time, less chancy, but maybe not so much. This is a wooden construction, different pieces of wood that have been cut to resemble leaf forms, and then placed together, overlapping each other in a three-dimensional relief. And in many ways, I think that we can talk about this being Dada as well, in that what he's trying to replicate with these wooden, fixed wooden pieces, what he's trying to replicate is the way leaves fall in the forest. This is why he calls it the forest, right? Because when leaves fall in the forest, it can create a very pleasing pattern of colors and shapes. But there is no human intervention, right? It just happens by chance. So the shapes here are, some of them are leaves, some of them are rocks in the forest on the right. And he's trying to get to that kind of beauty, that kind of aesthetic experience that originally, at least, is not created by human hands, and giving us a kind of construction that derives from that. So, art is really our first Dada artist in Zurich, and the one who's best represented around the DC area. I wanted to mention a few things about Dada Zurich, about the history of the group, because they did have a fairly tight cohesion as a group. It had been founded by a couple of playwrights, Hugo Ball, who you see on the left, dressed up for a performance, and Tristan Tzara, who's a really famous playwright. And both Hugo Ball and Tristan Tzara, Hugo Ball's a German, Tzara's a Romanian, had already been writing absurdist dramas prior to the Dada movement. And in fact, there's a long tradition of absurdist theater going back to the late 19th century. Absurd things happen. It's usually satire, right? One of the more famous ones is Per Ubu, which is from the Symbolist period. That is all of Father Ubu, which is all about sort of crazy satire, but it's all totally absurd, right? So Ball and Tzara are pushing this, and they're kind of at the core of the Dada group. So, like the Futurists, it's not just art, right? It's all kinds of arts together, right? And it was Ball and Tzara who founded the exhibition space in Zurich for the Dada group. They had a club, if you will, right? And the exhibition space was called Cabaret Voltaire. Voltaire, the great Enlightenment era thinker, this is certainly coined as a term with a tongue-in-cheek, because isn't the Enlightenment really all about rationality anyway? Although Voltaire himself is a social critic. So it plays with those two ideas that in many ways this modern Voltaire, if you will, they will be to their era what Voltaire was to his social critics, but without that sort of Enlightenment fidelity to rationality. Right? So this is where they would perform. And what we're seeing on the left is the only known photograph of Ball with this crab hand and these tubes. He dressed up in these painted cardboard cylinders, and actually he couldn't move. He had to be carried on the stage. He was walking out there, they set him up, and he performs this absolute, this poem that's gibberish. It's just, they're nonsense words, right? Absolute gibberish. And feverishly, like a madman. It's an insanity for them. It's a great theme. They're kind of like the romantics in the 19th century that way. Like all these dark sides of humanity. And at the end, Paul said, bathed in sweat, I was carried off the stage like a magical bishop. Right? Anyway, I've seen pictures of this colorized where the stripes on his hat are blue and the cone around his shoulders is yellow. Right? So really pushing the limits of, they're really, I think they're consciously trying to piss off their audience. Or at least, confound them, confuse them, and jar them out of tradition and comfort and into a different kind of world, which is kind of the point, right? They're reacting against the war, which really does more damage that way than they are. So that's the big thing. With this idea of getting up and just reciting gibberish, right? You notice he's got two evils with, like it's told gibberish, but it's scripted, right? He's not just, speaking in tongues or something like that. He's not just, out there going, he's got it all written down. And we still have the text of this. But other Dada at the Cabaret Voltaire did other things. They performed what they called accidental poems. And what they would do is they would cut individual words out of the newspaper. And then they would drop them into a paper bag. And then they would reach in and pick them out and put them together. And that became the poem. Right? Utterly random, blind chance, what words come out, what order they go in. Irrationality, right? And then they would read these poems, and when they read them, they were accompanied by music. I should say music in quotes. Because what they called it was, they called it noise. Bruitisme, which is in French, bruitisme, is basically this cacophony of noise. And there was a Dada show here almost 10 years ago now. And they had not only 15 pianos playing at the same time, and just and horns blasting, and sirens from ambulances, and massive fans, industrial fans blowing as well. Just these noises everywhere, as they're now reciting words that have absolutely no sort of rational context or syntax, right? And that idea of breaking down the normal syntax of the sentence might sort of think, oh, wait, remember the Futurists, right? Zhang Tun Tun by Marinetti also was the destruction of syntax, where words were there for sort of making sounds and whatnot. Again, the interconnections between these different groups is so strong, Online, I talk about the fact that the Futurists are behind some of the Russian modern movements, like suprematism. And they certainly have a connection to the Dada group. The big difference is that the Futurists love war. The Dadaists are pacifists. They hate it. Right? But they've got some of the same agenda items when it comes to the traditions of art. Again, another nice quote from art. While the thunder of batteries rumbled in the distance, batteries, bombs falling, guns going off, right? While the thunder of batteries rumbled in the distance, we pasted, we recited, we versified, we sang with all of our souls. We searched for an elementary art that would be thought save mankind from the furious folly of these times. They're trying to reflect their period, but also trying to get people to understand the cacophony that's going on outside and hopefully move past it. Right? So, this is Dada Zurich, centering around the Cabaret Voltaire, centering around these two literary figures. And the major artist to come out of the Zurich group is Hans Hart. Dada spreads. This idea of irrationality, especially during the war and after it, spreads throughout all of Europe, spreads even across the Atlantic to America. And the next year, in 1916, a Dada group forms in New York. Interestingly, they say, we're not Dada, which would be a very Dada thing to say, right? To deny that you're actually part of the group. But again, it's expatriates who have gathered in a neutral country. We don't enter the war until late 1718 with the thinking of the Lusitanians. So in 1916, America is still a neutral country. We're trying to stay out of the war. And it became a place where artists would flee trying to get away from the battle. So Tristan Tzara, right, Hugo Ball, these people moved to Switzerland from Germany and Romania to escape the war to a neutral country. In New York, the same thing. Expatriates fleeing the war. And the central figure in the New York Dada movement is Marcel Duchamp, who you can probably tell from his name, right? It's a Frenchman. And he's here writing out the war. Right? The New York Dada group has nothing to do with the Zurich group. It's not like there's a central Dada office. That wouldn't make sense anyway, right? That would be organized. You know? They have nothing to do with it. They share some of their ideas. They take things in a slightly different way. Chance enters into it still, but there's more to it than that. The New York group is independent. And we'll see later, after the war, there are Dada outposts in Germany. Those were also all independent, except for the fact that they refer to themselves as Dada. Right? So, Duchamp had moved from France to New York in 1915. Right? And he does this work a few years later, 1917. This is in Philadelphia, by the way. I used to hate this when I was undergrad, so if you're thinking this is crazy, well, that's what Duchamp probably wants you to think. It's crazy. Right? He took a men's toilet. Now, Demetrius and I know exactly what that is. Right? You women may not see these as often as we do, you know, but that's a man's standing urinal. And all he's done is he's taken it off the wall, or probably out of a showroom somewhere, stood it up on end, right? Because that's the pipe here. That leads the water in for the flushing, and then it would go out this end, right? So you stand here, right? So it's tipped up, okay? So then it would come off the wall, right? So this is the catch the stuff, yeah? He's turned it up on end, and he signs it. But what's interesting is he signs it not with his own name. R. Mutt. That's a date. Okay? That's all he did. He didn't change it. He didn't cast a toilet. Right? He didn't carve something and make it look like a toilet. It's straight out of a hardware store. Right? Well, we'll get to that. Right? That's the pseudonym he chooses. And in fact, Duchamp loves playing with words, and he loves playing with his identity, and he loves playing with pseudonyms in particular, right? Other names that he works under. And Armud is the first time we're seeing it. That's the first time he did it, right? Now, in many ways, I think we can say that this is very similar to the ideas that Art was exploring in Zurich. One of the things that Art did when he drops these things on the ground is really he's saying that the direct touch of the artist's hand is not really important, right? If it's arranged by chance and not by the artist, then what the artist actually does begins to take a back seat, right? Because they're getting rid of the planning and everything like that. So the artist is really just coming up with the idea, and then everything else is going to intervene inside, right? Well, Duchamp is kind of the same thing. In fact, it makes that look tame by comparison. Because what has he done here? Really, absolutely nothing. There is no intervention of the artist's hand, except the darn signature, which you'll notice is scrawled as if he just sort of picked up a stick for the first time in his life, you know? Right? Like caveman writing, you know? Not a fluid signature or anything like that, but rather, what do I say, Cro-Magnon looking or something. Yeah? In many ways, while this is a difficult work to enjoy, it's an amazing work to think of the ideas that Duchamp is beginning to traffic in here. The ideas that he's working with. And one of them is that even though he's removed the artist's hand, he's actually giving an amazing amount of power to the artist. Because what Duchamp is suggesting here is that being an artist is not making things. Being an artist is knowing what art is. So the artist doesn't have to make art to be an artist. Artists can designate things as being art. And in many ways, that almost gives one more power. You studio guys, do you ever sit around and talk about the what is art question? Duchamp would say an art is anything an artist says is art. As soon as the artist designates it as art, that's it. That would be a dollar proclamation about it, right? What I've always found interesting, because, I was in art school as well, right? I had a studio degree too. We used to do it as well, and even into grad school. And I think what's always fascinating about that question is that we have this idea that bad art isn't art. You know what I mean? Like, just because it sucks doesn't mean it isn't art. Just because it fails at what it attempts to do, or isn't particularly innovative, doesn't mean it isn't art. We have this kind of ivory tower conception about what is art. And I've always had some difficulty with that. When we have that conversation, we don't talk about what is good art, what is bad art. We talk about what is art and what is not art. Well, Duchamp is certainly questioning that. And with this work, if you think it's not art, what you have to do then is you have to decide where the line divide. What goes here, what goes there, right? What goes on the art side, what goes on the this isn't art side. He's really forcing you to think about it, right? Think about the issues behind this. But he's having this idea that his role as an artist isn't kind of artist who makes something. He's the artist who designates something to be art, and maybe also telling us that there are things out there in the world that have artistic merit that you don't think about as art. The fountain, for example. Fountains, right, are made of usually marble, with sculptures of beautiful things, Greek statues and whatnot. Well, doesn't porcelain somewhat resemble marble in its way? Polished marble, right? It's white, gleaming, with this incredibly simplified form. There's a famous story when he was still in Paris. Duchamp, in 1912, went to the Paris Air Show. Okay? He's going to go see an exhibition of airplane technology, which is still pretty new, right? Just before the war. And he walks up to this propeller, this, wooden propeller from an old plane, right? And it's, how propellers bend and sweep, right? So that they can cut through the air and propel the aircraft. He looks at it, he says to another painter that he's with, painting's washed up. Right? He looks at this propeller and says, we're done. Right? He says, who will ever do anything better than that propeller? Tell me, could you do that? Could you, as a painter or as a sculptor, make anything as perfect and beautiful as that propeller? You might say, oh yeah, you could, but there's a precision and an elegance to these machine-based forms that he's responding to. And that's probably there with the toilet as well, with the fountain. Now, another important thing about this is Duchamp has this, of all the artists we've looked at, and maybe all the artists that we will look at, Duchamp has a sense of humor. And it comes through the way he titles things, the way he signs them. Sarah's question about art, right? A fountain spits fluid, right? A toilet receives fluid, right? While fluid goes into it rather than coming out of it. So by titling it the fountain, he's turning its normal use upside down, in the same way that he's turned its normal orientation 90 degrees. Right? And as a fountain, you think of those holes or this here as the place where the water would come out, but in fact, that's exactly the opposite of what would happen with the holes that you see. Right? And with this idea that there are forms out there that painters could never really do as well as the forms themselves, this propeller comment, The whole point, I think, of that's hard. Art, I think, is something that we've done that makes us see the world in a different way. That's what good art should do. It should make you look at your world differently than you looked at it before you saw that piece or thought about that piece. It should make you understand something that you didn't understand before. You might have had some understanding of it, but it's going to make you see it in a different way. That's what good art is. And all good art is going to make you reconsider. And I don't care if we're talking about literature, right, or visual art. It's going to make you understand something about the human condition that you didn't get left, the world around you. You're never going to look at a toilet again the same way, because of what Duchamp has done. Right. And at the same time, it's a total kick in the teeth. Even now, 100 years later, this is still one of the most difficult things for people to deal with. What the hell is he doing? Right? But this idea that these forms are better than any kind of art he might make is picked up with that signature that Sarah asked about. What's with the signature? Well, what's a mutt? A dog. What kind of dog? Mixed breed, right? A mongrel, right? Not a purebred, not an elite dog, but just a mutt, right? Mutts are the best. They're nicer, they live longer, they have fewer health problems, blah, 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 blah. That's just me, right? Well, in this case, if you think about this, something self-deprecating about this. Even artists, right? Artists tend to think that we're working in a venue that's very different from the normal world. It's the result of intellect and craft. But this is a very self-deprecating way of talking about himself. He's denouncing what it means to be an artist. Right? There's no ivory tower here. Yeah? He's a mutt. Armut. Right? That said, Armut in German, the Armut, is the German word for poverty. Now, this could be a comment on the poor artist, the starving artist syndrome, right? He's not poor. Best quote ever from an artist. Duchamp said, I don't want to get rich. I want to break even plus 10%. I think if you think about that, right? Break even plus 10%. So you can spend whatever you want to spend, buy whatever you want to buy, and have 10%. Right? Poverty, the artist might be part of it, but it might also be the idea of going back to that quote, that really famous quote about the propeller. Could anybody make one of these? Right? In art. Is art dead? Is art impoverished and needs to look somewhere else? Is it coming up short compared to other things? Remember when he sees that propeller, the first thing he says is, painting is washed up. Painting is impoverished. Right? So Armut has a sort of a multiple play on words here. Right? The mongrel dog, the poverty that is the traditions of art. And how many artists in the modern world have been trying to upend tradition? Right? Not just Duchamp. It's also a very famous comic strip. You know about Mutt and Jeff? Mutt's got the mutton chop. I think, no, excuse me. Jeff's got the mutton chop. Mutt's the tall one there. A couple of low-class people in a humorous comic strip in the teens and 20s. He's making reference to all these things by calling it Armut or signing it Armut. Right? So there's Mutt and Jeff as well. These are all references he's making. Now, as you might imagine, 1917, this thing goes on display. Do you think people are happy to see it? Do you think people like being challenged like that in 1917? Not at all. The critical backlash is, and has been for a while. Duchamp has been a provocateur in New York. His work started showing up in New York in 1912, and people were reacting against him almost immediately. And they weren't these sort of sound objects, right? But there was a huge critical backlash. And it's a lover at the time, Beatrice Wood. They fell for each other right away, she said. And they were lovers for a short time and remained friends for the rest of their lives. And she was a painter as well, debutante and a painter. But she wrote a defense of the fountain in the press. And what she said was, this is now a quote from her critical defense of this object. Whether Mr. Richard Mutt, with his own hands, made the fountain or not, has no importance. He chose it. He took an ordinary article of life, placed it so that its useful significance disappeared under the new title and the new point of view. He created a new thought for that object. He created a new idea for it. This idea of changing an intellectual standpoint, we've seen change in art a lot, right? We've seen artists try to incorporate change. Think of the futurists. Think of the cubists, right? For the cubists, you move around an object, you see it from multiple points of view, change. Futurists, the object moves, there's change. For Duchamp, who knows the futurist, who knows Picasso, before he moves back to New York, he's looking for a change in psyche, a change in outlook, a change in who the person is. And so by taking this work and changing it and retitling it in this review, it mentions this a very important thing. He created a new thought for the object. Change the way you think about it. Change. Right? Now, as it turns out, we now know that this entire review was written by Duchamp himself. She let him use her name. Right? And Duchamp often used pseudonyms for things. Why did he use her name instead of his own? Well, because you know darn good to write his own defense. Right? But there's other things as well. He loves using women's names that have sort of naughty double entendres. And in this case, Beatrice Wood, she went by Beato, B-E-A-T-O, Beato Wood. This is embarrassing. There's a male euphemism that has to do with beating wood, right? And I think Duchamp knows that because in addition to the idea of this undercurrent of change, there's also an undercurrent of eroticism and sex in a lot of his works. You might not think that right away from looking at a toilet on its head, but it's there as part of his sense of humor that he has. What's coming up here? He also began making these things when he was still in Paris. Before he moved to New York in 1916, he began to make these. There are numerous versions of this. This one's in MoMA in New York, but there's one in Philadelphia as well, right? So there's both of these are there. The bicycle wheel. He began doing these sort of collages of different objects. There's a duel with the front wheel of a bicycle. Stuck in it. You can still spin the wheel if you want to. Not in the museum, but one could if you owned it, right? You go walk up and touch a Duchamp in the museum, they'll get mad at you, right? But it's a kinetic sculpture, right? It can move. It's actually probably the very first kinetic sculpture, even though Namgabo, your guy, started making kinetic sculptures, gliders that whip, right, with the motors underneath. Right? He called these works, these found object sculptures that he began making in 1912, 1913. He called them ready-made, which I think is also part of his sense of humor, right? It's ready-made. It's there for you to think. Now, fashion people, what's a ready-made? Do you know this? Right, it's a rack suit, right? It's a suit off the rack versus a bespoke suit, right? I buy ready-made. I can't afford to get measured to have a tailored suit made just for me, right? So I buy a 44 rig. That's my suit, right? And the pants fit all the time. The suit fits more or less well all the time. That's a ready-made. It's a rack suit as opposed to a bespoke tailored suit. Right? He calls these ready-mades as well. They're mass-produced. Right? They are ready-made, and he becomes, as an artist, more like a customer in a department store. And just as you choose your clothing to make your persona, he chooses these objects and he puts together a little wardrobe of art, right? Sticks them together. But you'll notice that the objects are often these beautiful, machine-made, purified objects. The fork of that bicycle, right? Bicycles are beautiful. You know, they really are. Gorgeous pieces of metal, you know, nice sweep to the legs of the fork, or even, you know, Demetrius, those line things that you're working on, right? With those, look at that, and the spokes of a tire or a bicycle wheel, very much like that, you know. There's just something really gorgeous about it. Try to, you know, I remember when I was a kid, I used to work on bikes all the time, and I would just sit there and try to figure out. Like one time I remember I took the wheel entirely apart, so I had the hub there with all the wires, akimbo, and I was going to try and put it back together again. And I had to have another one there to figure out, okay, now, you know, how does it actually go to work? And it's much more complicated than it looks, right? And at the same time, it's kind of magic, because what happens with all those wires and the resistance between pushing up on one and pulling down on the other is that emptiness can be as solid as if it were solid, right? It can bear as much weight as if it were made of a single piece of metal. Yet there's nothing there. Sort of magic, if you will. These are the things that Duchamp wants. These sorts of modern, ready-made objects that have a beautiful aesthetic side to them, have a fascinating, measured, mathematical side to them. But again, the idea of a ready-made that he just chances upon is part of that Dada ethos. Chance. Right? Something he just happens upon. Also in Philadelphia, the bottle wrap. This is back in the day when early recycling, what they would do is they would take old wine bottles and you would have a metal brush that you would clean it out with. Like, you know, using a plunger, and then they would put them on the rack to dry. Right? So each of the spikes, you turn the bottle of wine upside down on the rack like that, and they would sit there and drip dry after you've cleaned them out, and then you could reuse the bottle, right, to refill it with wine. And here what he's done, sometimes he puts them on the ground. This one has been hung up in the air, and you can see it's signed down below. Right? Marcel Duchamp, and it's actually even titled as well, right? In this case, just bottle wrap. He's not changing the meaning of it with the title, but rather with how you look at it. Right? A bottle rack is something that suspends something else in the air. But now the bottle rack's suspended in the air as well. And I think when you see it out of context, you start to also see that it has a sort of a female form. If you ignore the spikes, you start to see shoulders and hips, you know, and a waist to the work, and he wants you to look at it differently. And as he begins to do these ready-mades, right, beginning in 1913, working all the way to 1917, he basically gives up painting. He'd been painting prior to this, we haven't seen it yet, right? And in the middle of working on these, just as he moves to New York in 1915, he poses this question to other artists that he's working with. Can we make a work of art that is not a work of, quote-unquote, art? Right? Can we make works of art that are not works of art? And with the ready-mades, he's trying to do that. And I think what he's trying to do is subvert the logic that's behind making a work of art. Right? So, he wants to make a work of art that isn't. The text also shows you one of his most famous ready-mades. This is postcard from the Louvre that he grabbed. He'd gone back to Paris after the war for a brief visit, picked up a nice hand-tinted postcard of the Mona Lisa, and put a mustache and a beard on her, and signed it himself. lower right corner. Heck with Leonardo, this is now my work of art, right? And then right in the bottom, where the postcard is squared off to become postcard shape, right? LHOOQ. Nonsense letters, right? LHOOQ. But what Duchamp is doing here is, again, it's totally with a sense of humor. He loves wordplay, just like with R. Mutt. LHOOQ. If you say it in French, L-H-O-O-Q. Right? That's how you pronounce those letters in French. L-H-O-O-Q. Right? And so if you were asked to say that, L-H-O-O-Q. L-H-O-O-Q, right? H-O-O-Q. She's got a hot. Or she's got fire in her pants. That's both of those things, right? She's hot to trot, right? Now, you've got to admit that with the Mona Lisa, that's not the last thing you ever think about with the Mona Lisa, right? It's such a standard part of art that you think about her beauty as the beauty of painting, the beauty of imagination, Leonardo and the landscape, all this. It's changing the way you think about it. And two things. One, smooth and humor and wordplay. Two, robotic overtones. Three, right, that change in your state of thinking. Right? Focusing on making you change. I used to have one of these before. I think I got wristed on by somebody, not out of meanness, and they wanted it themselves. Right? So he's got a really wicked sense of humor, Duchamp does. Part of the reason for this day is one of my favorite 20th century artists, that so few of them seem to, and at the same time it never compromises, I think in many ways, the importance and the seriousness of some of his ideas. Well, we've fairly recently got a Duchamp here in the DC area. There aren't that many here. This is Fresh Rideau. Another play on words, because it's, as you can see, a French window, right? It looks like a double set of French doors that you would have between the parlor and the living room or something like that in a fancy house. But it's quite small. It's not like this, right? It's just a little model. It maybe is a reference to women who were newly widowed by World War I, a fresh widow. At the same time, understanding Duchamp's eroticized sense of humor, the idea of a fresh widow is what? Probably fresh meat on the market, you know? Hey, great. The husbands are all gone, you know? Because I don't think that Duchamp tends to be very politically motivated in his work. That's not a big issue for him. Unlike the Zurich comic group, right? He's more interested in the issues around making art. And in this particular case, again, he didn't really do anything himself. He came up with the idea. He made the specs. He then hired a professional carpenter to make a miniature version of a French window. He went to a shoemaker and he got some patent leather, polished patent leather, that he stretched in the window panes. That's what the black is, right? It's leather. He wanted it to be shined like everyday shoes. Again, these clothing references in his work, right? Shoes for the window pane. And again, the idea of the window that you can't see through, right? The traditions of art, the idea of the window is long-standing in art. And in this case, he signed it with another pseudonym. Fresh Widow, copyright. I love that, right? Big bold letters, copyright. Even though what's the copyright? He didn't make it himself, right? And then he signs it Rose Salafi, 1920. This is another of his pseudonyms. Another of the times that he adopts actually a female persona, something he did quite often. Here's a portrait of him in drag. Lovingly, Rose Salavi, to alias Marcel Duchamp. Right over the arm. Yeah. Now, in this case, unlike our fresh widow, he signed Rose Salavi with a double R. R-O-S-E. Salavi. And you'll also notice that in French, it's given us the accent on the E. Right? And he's doing another word play. R Rose. This is what I'm saying. Right? R and honey, yeah. Yeah, Rose. You know, eroticism is life. Right? Yeah, Rose, say nothing. So again, he's doing this goofy wordplay where he's trying to hint to sexual undertones in work that really have none whatsoever in the first place. To make you think about them and not take things at face value, but continue to push how you're thinking about them. These ideas about the eroticism of art really are there at the very beginnings of his work. Stepping way back to when he's in Paris, you might remember this from Intro, The Nude Descending the Staircase. One of Duchamp's most famous works. It was his first work to be shown in New York. It came over for a major show in 1913. Duchamp wasn't here. It was a huge scandal. Right? But as you can tell from this early work, that Duchamp began as sort of somewhere between a cubist and a futurist. Right? You can see hallmarks of both of those things. Analytic cubism with the monochromatic brownish tones that we saw Picasso and Braque working with. Right? And this is at the same time they're doing that. This is just before we move into synthetic cubism. Right? But also the idea of a figure that's captured moving through space. Can you make out the figure? Yeah? No? There are also some motion, right? Think of this as the hip. There's a leg, right? So there's a knee, thigh, or not thigh, so shin, right? And if you think about this as the hip and this is the leg, so everything below you is the leg, then you start to see in a sort of stroke-like action, those legs moving up, right? Sometimes the knee takes back, you have these sweeping lines here, dotted lines here, and this then becomes the torso and the head. So this would be the shoulders here, arms coming out over here, right? And that's also the moving through space. So it's coming down into space, and what we see is the hip repeated again and again. You dig it out now? Steps from it down. The staircase comes back here. This is in Philadelphia, so it's out. That's the but you can make out pretty clearly as well that the staircase ends up going back this way. So the staircase comes down and then turns this way. Right. Already here, by calling this, is there anything to suggest that it's new? Not really, right? I mean, and he doesn't say, well, he does say, because he uses the female form of nude, so it should be used woman descending the staircase. But in French, using the word nude can be just masculine and feminine. So the nude woman descending the staircase. I think the reason this caused the scandal is because he suggests that it is a nude descending, even though Picasso's nude was much less scandalous. It's also perhaps a little bit less recognizable. By using this as a theme, Duchamp is, in a sort of simple way here, also pointing to some of the erotic undertones that will characterize his art in the coming decades. It's one of two or three works that had this basic style that he was working on. I should mention that Duchamp was part of that same group in the suburbs of Paris, the Golden Section group from Puteaux. Remember them? We thought the Orphists came out of that, right? He's there as well. Right? He's part of that group. Another work from the same period where he's again almost impossible to read insofar as trying to read it. The passage from Virgin to Bride, slightly earlier than the nude descending the staircase, but much more complicated insofar as how he's abstracted the figure and what it means. Both of them are about the passage of time, right? The passage from Virgin to Bride. Again, think about the kinds of change we've tended to see in Duchamp's art. Change in a mental state. The passage from Virgin to Bride. In this case, it's a passage from the mindset of being a virgin to the mindset of being a bride. Now, if you think about what that passage is, what causes that passage? Marriage, right? But what goes along with that? How do you go from being a virgin to being a bride? You have sex. Right? What is the passage from virgin to bride? What is the difference? Experience, right? And nothing more than that. Now, granted, you can have that experience and not become a bride, but that's not the issue here, right? It's an obvious eroticism that the title evokes. And that's probably why people reacted to the nude descending the staircase as well, in such a negative way. Again, both of them seem to be the similar kinds of forms moving across the canvas from left to right. Here, however, it's much more difficult to sort of make out any recognizable human forms. You end up with these sort of quasi-mechanical forms. What's often pointed to is that some of the ways those smeared forms look like chocolate grinders. When you grind up cocoa beans to make chocolate, these massive wheels turn and they run over the chocolate with the oil in it to spread it out. And when it spreads, it ends up looking like that. Like that. These areas that look like they've been squeegeed on the surface have a reference back to chocolate. And Duchamp is very aware of this because he's doing paintings of chocolate grinders as well at exactly the same time. Now, the chocolate reference in this is obvious for its relationship to courtship, right? When do you get a box of chocolates? Valentine's Day, right? Your anniversary, if you become a bride. What are chocolates supposed to do? It's supposed to be aphrodisiacs, right? So bringing in these sort of chocolate grinder references, Duchamp is emphasizing again the erotic content of the work. Now you'll also notice that with the chocolate grinder, when it comes down to it, he's a very good, precise painter. In fact, he's really terrific at sort of very, very precise drawing, particularly of machinery. He's going abstract and going into these ready-made objects by choice, and not from a lack of skill. So far, by the way, all of these are in Philadelphia. Everything we've seen from Duchamp so far has come out of Philadelphia. So he's linking machinery and eroticism together. He's linking chocolate to the passage from virgin to bride. These are important ideas for Duchamp. They're ideas that he shares with other artists that came out of Paris and moved with him to New York. When he was living in Paris, he was close friends with Picabia. Remember Francis Picabia is one of this Couteau group, these golden section painters that came from the suburbs of Paris. They were an offshoot of Cubism. We looked at this work from the National Gallery showing a procession of nuns in Sevilla, in Spain, that Picabia had done. He and Duchamp are old friends, right? Going back to their time in Paris together. And after Duchamp moved to New York, Kaguya follows him. And he picks up many of these same ideas that link machines and sex. Precisely drawn machines with the sexual act. So here we've got gears, right? And you know from bicycles how gears work, right? You turn, if you have a little one and a big one, you turn the big one slow, the little one just rips, right? It turns very, very fast. Because for every one revolution of the little one, you're going to get only about a fifth of a revolution of the big one. So if the big one goes around once, right, the little one goes around 12. This is why on a bicycle, right, you've got the crank on the big pocket on the front, and you have a tiny pocket on the back. This one of this gives you 3 or 4 wheels. Okay? So he's got the big wheel and the little wheel, and all of these references to how it works in directions of force and whatnot. He even says machine turn quickly. Machine turn at a beat. In other words, hit it fast, right? But down at the bottom is almost as if it's a diagram. That's exactly what it is. Number one is and number 2 is man. So as the man turns a little bit, the woman gets with, right? In being fast. So it's again, this is not accepted in this way, right? What little things men do by women. Whirling dirty. So he's just over sharing many, many ideas about the modern machine is placed in the world. And its references not to humans. It'll be a really great simultaneous attitude on the machine. Because so many artists and artist groups have had it, but in very different ways. They share certain visual characteristics, but the ideas that they're trying to get out of it are totally different. The Kaguya, suggesting them, did a series of portraits of people as machines. And they were never as, like, you know, the type of person who was getting portraits of me shooting with a machine. I might just want to smart, right? He did one of those. He did one of those photographers where it was just him, a broken camera, with a car handling stuff. And using these sort of mechanized portraits of people, ways of showing who they were, what they were like, without actually showing who they were. But drawing that connection between the machine as part of the modern world and the identity of the person. Think of Maggie's work from last fall. I think there was something there that I really tried to talk more about. How we like computers from seeing the show, right? And a part of it was to get into the same kind of idea. How can we show who we are without showing who we are? And the Kaguya is definitely doing that here in New York Dot. What's coming up? Oh, I've got one more. Wait, one more? I don't. So I think we're going to look at Dada in Germany. And I think before we don't, 2 minutes, it's not enough time. So I emailed you your progress report. If you haven't gotten one to me yet, please get it to me sooner than later. And so I can get some comments back to you that you can use. I'll be getting your ISMS stuff to you tonight or tomorrow morning. Those of you who turned in ISMS essays, I'll be getting those back to you with revision comments and a deadline for getting the revisions done. You know, reasonable deadline that doesn't overlap with other things. Again, if you can clear April 16th out, we'll go up and see. There's more there than just Duchamp. But he does play really well live. Okay? So have a good weekend. Try to beat the heat, as it were. That's what's going away tonight.